tēnā koutou katoa, namaste, ni hao, good evening. Well, look, I just firstly want to acknowledge May. I just think at a leadership level, both around issues of food safety, but also are we doing enough as a country, I think, to enable some of our Asian leaders to be at the boardroom table, and you and I have talked about that, and my view is we've got a long way to go, actually. Can I also acknowledge Teo and Fonterra? It's been a rough period, being there together, mate. Slightly distanced, obviously, because I've had to be in terms of Minister for Food Safety. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The importance of me being very independent at the cabinet table in this position has been quite an important aspect of how we've dealt with this. But I do want to say that we have visiting delegations all across the world, from politicians to companies, and they universally say to me, what an amazing company you are. You're at the forefront of technology, science, you are doing some incredible stuff on the ground, particularly in new emerging markets and developing nations. So I just want to take this opportunity to publicly say that we do know the high calibre and standard that Fonterra are operating at, and regardless of what has happened, there are a lot of people across the world that know that, and I know that this is effectively, and I've got some caveats around that, I think a speed bump in your history as a company. So, it is correct that I've been in the role for a couple of months. I'm also Minister of Civil Defence, and I think there's a few analogies there that I can give. And in fact, I often joke about it slightly, that I have just been managing, we've been literally 3 or 4 hours sleep for weeks around the food safety incident. We've convened, if you didn't know, within 24 hours, I had a meeting of half of Cabinet around this issue. That's how seriously we took it. Because when you look back at it, you're dealing with Fonterra, our largest food company, you're dealing with babies, and you're dealing with a botulism scare. And at that particular moment, we didn't know. We just didn't know what the test results were going to end up showing up. So I give the analogy that it was like our alpine fault of food safety. It doesn't get any worse than that for our New Zealand economy. 50% of our exports are food, and it was an incredibly serious situation. And I think I was driving up the ramp of the Wellington airport after weeks and weeks of obviously, there were about 8 core ministers that were meeting regularly on it. We're obviously dealing with so many different nations that were affected in terms of the recall, trying to work out where this product was, trying to manage all of the political relationships that went with that. So regardless of what you think in terms of some of the way that it may have been managed in terms of both risk communication, it was an incredibly serious incident that pretty much took half of Cabinet to be mopping up for a period of time. But I was coming up the ramp, and then one set of Wellington earthquakes hit. So I remember thinking to myself, curse of Kaye, but there are many analogies. And I think the whole issue, if I could leave you in this room to walk away with one core message, because I'm going to talk about the stuff that we're doing to strengthen our food safety system, to strengthen the way that we respond to incidents like this in the future. But the one key phrase that I would leave you with is risk communication. And I'm going to talk you through that in terms of what do I actually think, how good is our food safety system, right? What actually happened and how do we put that into context? And then what can we do in the future to learn from some of the things that happened here, and what can New Zealand Asian leaders do as well to help us in the future? So we are world leading. It didn't take a ministerial inquiry to say that, but it was bloody helpful actually. And I'll talk about why we actually call for that ministerial inquiry. But for 130 years, people have been buying our products. The Honourable Tim Grosser has gone across the Asia Pacific region. We signed, I think, about 13 free trade agreements. People want our food. We have had a relatively good history in terms of food safety for a range of reasons that some of them are actually quite soft, right? So one is relationships. People generally trust New Zealanders, right? That's because we have very low corruption. We don't have a whole lot of people contaminating our food. In other nations, you do have that actually. We actually have because we're so isolated at a pest level, pretty low down the scheme of things. Our biosecurity system is actually really crucial in that area. But basically, as many of you will know, we operate on a risk-based system with good science, right? But the key thing for that, in order for that system to work, in my view, is that you've got your calibration right in terms of verification and compliance, right? That is actually quite important. I agree with what Teo's just said in terms of, there are countries around the world where their model of food safety is a whole lot of people, standing at the end of a wharf and checking a product. That's an old system. It's not the best system. Actually, a risk-based system that's got science at the heart of it, that's evidence-based, that has enough of the dial turned in terms of verification and compliance, is world leading. So, in terms of the incident, what we realised very quickly was, one, that it was quite an uncertain situation, right? And there are a range of things that ministerial inquiries looked at, from testing to a number of other things that happened during it. But, if you went back, would we not, or would the trigger have not been pulled? Absolutely not. We are dealing with babies. One baby dies, we might as well kiss 20% of the New Zealand GDP goodbye, right? So in any food safety system, there is going to be an error rate. We've been having recalls in New Zealand for generations, actually. So what makes this different? Well, as I said before, I think the fact that it's Fonterra, it's babies, it's botulism scare, which is very rare. Anyone who knows, and now I have a fairly good understanding of you can imagine botulism versus, and the different strains of it. But, when it happened, we spent the first couple of months firstly working out, obviously trying to track and trace that product to be able to salvage relationships with overseas regulators that were saying, well, hang on, how can we find this product? But then secondly, is it or isn't it contaminated? Is this going to cause my baby to die, right? And that took quite a long period of time. The one thing I have said publicly in terms of Fonterra, and I have been quite restricted because obviously there's been a compliance investigation underway that was separate to me as Minister for Food Safety. So just so you know, and again this is about confidence of other regulators in other countries, it's very important that they understand that while it might be the Ministry for Primary Industries, the compliance team are incredibly separate at a political level. I can tell you, I think I once walked past a room that they were in and I may have waved, right? So I have had nothing to do with their investigation. And that's what's made it quite difficult at communication at a political level, is that the moment that we realised we really needed to have a ministerial inquiry to look at the two things. One is what happened, right, which was part A, and B, what do we need to learn in terms of our food safety systems? Do there need to be changes? Are we world leading? And that was about restoring confidence. And that first part reported back. I think there's a very good team on that inquiry. I want to just acknowledge publicly Miriam Dean, but also some of the other members that you may not have necessarily heard their names. I mean, you've got Tony Noel there, Dr. Anne Aston. She's incredibly respected in Australia, and I remember when Minister Guy and I were picking these people, I also ended up calling the head of food safety in Ireland and Professor Riley. I just rang him and I said, hi, it's Minister for Food Safety here from New Zealand. And he started laughing and said, I know who you are, you're on every newspaper across the world, but a really respected individual. So we've had the world's best on this, right? That inquiry, it did say, it said, look, you're world leading, but there are some areas where we need to strengthen. And we need to be completely open and honest about that, because if I can tell you, when I was sitting at the dinner table with the President of China, with the Prime Minister, and when I met the Vice Premier, and when I met a number of other senior politicians in China, they were incredibly complimentary in terms of the way that we handled it. They accepted that actually There are food safety scares that happen all the time. They understand the cultural differences, but they were impressed with our ability and what they expected of New Zealand culture, which was that we were open and transparent. As a small democratic nation, that is actually one of our greatest attributes, but there are challenges with that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in terms of where we go from here around greater transparency and reporting, and what does that mean, will that hurt us with other nations in terms of when they're not as open as we are. And so, what that inquiry showed is it said, look, in the area of science, we spend about 1.8 million, but we need to spend more. It is ridiculous if you're going to have the backbone of your country and your food safety system to be underpinned by good science, then we're not spending enough. So Minister Kaye and I took through Cabinet. We immediately said, yep, Cabinet accepted all of the recommendations in principle. We turned that report around because as well, we knew the importance of what we could control in terms of speed and confidence in restoring our reputation within 48 hours. And we agreed to a Food Safety Science Research Centre to really strengthen that first pillar in terms of science. The next thing that the inquiry looked at is they said, well, actually, there's been huge shifts in your trade profile. And this is what I think, just reiterating what Teo said, we can do some things in terms of the pillars of our system around legislation and science, but relationships are crucial. And if I think about, for instance, the meat situation that we had last year, some of you will know the detail around that, but basically in the Minister of Europe, in any situation we would have probably that happen with Australia, we'd get on the phone and say, mate, there's been a bit of stuff up with paperwork, just can you sort it out and you'll get shipments of our meat come through. The difference is, and it's what our agencies need to understand and New Zealanders need to understand and business need to understand, it is a very different scenario in China if you get your paperwork wrong in terms of food, because it might mean something very different. It might actually mean fraud. And we don't have that cultural background. So us actually understanding things like paperwork, which we might call bureaucracy or whatever, is incredibly important in certain nations. And the deepening of relationships between those agencies, MPI and AQSIQ and CNCA is also very important. And just to touch on China, the other thing that people probably don't realise, many of you will understand, is while we have been doing a number of things in terms of food safety, over the last probably 2 years, China have massively been lifting their food safety laws. So the level of change and some of the things that have happened are actually about what China is doing to make sure they can actually feed their people in a safe way. And so they've undergone massive change in terms of their agencies around CNCA, and I've met with various people from CNCA around that. But then also the infant formula situation is actually quite in big part them lifting their laws, right? And what they require of us. So the next thing that the ministerial inquiry said was, you need to be able to look out at a strategic level. And there's been a whole lot of discussion about, well, the Ministry for Primary Industries merger, should New Zealand Food Safety Authority have come back in? The inquiry looked at it, they said, look, we don't want to go back, we actually don't think that the majority of stakeholders out there want change, right? And I can tell you this now, and I've had this conversation with officials quite a few times. When I flew in on that morning after, so I got the call at about 5 and was talking to Cabinet Ministers sort of late into the evening, and I was on the 6 a.m. flight back to Wellington. I walked into a room and there were probably 70 officials across government. So that's MFAT, NZTE, MPI, everybody mobilised. We have quite a clear operation, just like civil defence. When we have an emergency, we actually had a whole lot of processes in place. So it may not have looked all tidy, but actually the story that will one day be told in terms of the operation that was going on behind the scenes, from my perspective, there might be some improvements, but was pretty massive actually. And one of the key things that MPI, and I've discussed with them, is you would not have got that with New Zealand Food Safety Authority, right? But also at a biosecurity level, more and more we're looking at the food chain and how we make sure, whether it's the issue of DCD, that ability to have people operating right across MPI to make sure that we understand that whole food chain and have people operating at every level, I don't think you could get from New Zealand Food Safety Authority. The one crinkle in it that the ministerial inquiry did show up is it said, look, so we don't want to go back, we understand the reasons for the merger, but that the alignment needed to be a lot clearer, the difference between the regulator and what is effectively your growth and your business growth agenda. And so Martin Dunn's done a whole lot of work there. Another key thing, New Zealand's legislative framework, and look, I believe that what you want to hear here actually is honesty around where we need the improvements and then where we sit in the context, because we are very world leading, but we need to actually make some of these changes. You can't sit on your laurels. There are people that say to me China will lead in food safety within 7 or 8 years. They are moving at a rapid pace, and New Zealand cannot just rely on its historical reputation. We have to make sure our system updates itself and moves at that pace as well. So the other area is our legislative framework, and I did say to the Deputy Prime Minister the other day, we have to be clear. The food bill sat on the Parliament statutes for 10 years. In development and then in the House. And I was very pleased to be able to get that through the House a couple of weeks ago. But we need to be, in order to be able to continue to go across the world and say that we're world leading, we cannot have an old outdated statute that's based, food safety system that's based on premises and not on the risk of food. So that is quite an important tool, not only domestically, but the principles are important for things like the Animal Products Act moving forward. The other thing they said was it's quite complicated in terms of explaining to our overseas trading partners the difference between the Animal Products Act, the Wine Act, the Food Bill. So I've got a whole lot of work underway. I put through the Food Bill, the recall provisions, so there were some genuine serious issues that arose as a result of WPC. And those legislative amendments are now gone through in the Food Bill, and they actually deal with that situation that we were in with this incident, which is when you just don't know, right? It was quite uncertain for a while there in terms of the powers that we had around that recall, and I make no apologies for the fact that we, now have a law that in that situation, we can move. Because we can't muck around when we have a situation like that. And I am conscious that while we've had we've had one part of the ministerial inquiry come back around the lessons learned, we've still got the other part underway, and so I don't want to go too much the sort of line here that I'll go into, and I'll just sort of stop there, but there are still some things that need to be ironed out. So there's an omnibus bill piece of work as well, which I'm focusing on to make sure that we really simplify our legislative framework that we can in the future. So there were some very good things actually that came out of that first part of the ministerial inquiry. Said we're world leading, but as a result, we're taking it up another level. I sort of say we're strengthening our system by another 10%, and we probably actually wouldn't have had that, or at the rapid pace that we've gone, or the government investment, if the incident didn't happen. So there's a shining silver light. And we've put a huge amount of money as well, not into just those changes, but also into our capability overseas. So here comes the bigger picture, I think, from a relationship perspective and a risk communication and a communication perspective. And this is where you guys come in. Because I think, here's my view, our trade profile, take infant formula, has just shifted so dramatically. People call it the gold rush. But we haven't had the level of relationships built that we've built over 100 years, right? You've also got some serious, I think, quite cultural differences. You've got language differences. And then you've just got this boom that is coming in terms of people wanting our products. So it is a potential recipe for some very serious issues. So what are we going to do about it? Well, the first thing is we've again moved in that area in terms of government investment. I think we put about $5 billion into core overseas markets. That's people on the ground in our posts that actually have the skills in food safety and agricultural production, so that when Carl, who's our ambassador in China, is at a meeting, he has the best people at the table who actually understand technically what we need to do in terms of changes around overseas market access rules. Why is that really important? Well, as I said to, and I sit on the business growth agenda, so I had this conversation with Joyce and Grocer and Guy, you change one rule around cooling of meat, you could be dealing with $100 million change. So the focus that governments need to have in the future around those overseas market access rules, what's coming in terms of whether it's Indonesia, Vietnam, China, right? You're at an intelligence level, the gathering of that, some of that needs to come from business, and we need to have our MPI people, our consular people, all connected with whatever intelligence is happening at a business level, to enable us to be able to negotiate where we can, but also where we can't. And that's also part of playing in the sandpit, recognising you take China and infant formula, there are serious cultural reasons why they are massively outbreaking up in the States. When you have that number of babies die, then there are certain rules that you're going to change, and there's certain rules that are going to be much harder. And I think, so the government's doing its bit in terms of investment on the ground and having those people in those markets. But as I said to I sat down with a number of companies that are particularly working in China but are going all over the world. And I've given them quite a hard message, which is, if industry in New Zealand, every time an overseas market access rule changes that they don't like, turn to the government and say, we'll fix it for us. That is a very immature view, and it's a very short-term strategy in terms of growth. Right? Because they should be on the ground there, building the relationships with CNCA, AQSIQ, which is what countries in Denmark and Denmark and a number of other countries are doing. I think they've actually got quite a big lobby group on the ground. And so that's another area that we're looking at, is we do think that individual companies need to ensure they've got capability, but actually there's probably a case for having a stronger business grouping presence. And that's where I think New Zealand Asian leaders can help facilitate some of that discussion, so that whether it's Indonesia, Vietnam, China, they know that it's not just the government that has a presence, but they also know that there is going to be an amount of lobbying that happens at a business level, which is entirely appropriate for industry. The next thing that I'd say is, and some of the stuff is a bit softer, but I think it's equally as important. If we continue to have in our school system young people that study French and German, that's fine. That's absolutely entirely appropriate. But I'm Associate Minister of Education, and I can tell you now that we need to move a bit faster in terms of the shift of young New Zealanders studying Mandarin, but also other languages, so not just China. And I think we'll have more to say about that. So, but it has to happen, because if our business is going to shift and the trade profile is going to shift, then we need not just New Zealand Asian leaders to be able to walk into a business room in Shanghai or Mumbai. We need a whole lot more New Zealanders to be able to do that in business. I think as well, in terms of, from a cultural perspective, so I think, we've done our amount around the actual system changes and investment in that, whether that's science, whether that's Food Safety Assurance Council looking forward, whether that's simplifying our tertiary instruments. There is an amount that some businesses are getting it, and they're, I think, investing in their capability. They've got people on the ground. We're doing some things in market, but the softer stuff around the young New Zealanders that are coming through and making sure that they're skilled and able to communicate is going to be very important. But then, I come back to what I said at the beginning, which is around risk communication. So there will be the next part of the ministerial inquiry. It will report back, and we had to wait obviously for any potential court processes that are now completed. But but it will basically say what exactly happened, what were the facts of the case. Now you can imagine there are some lawsuits around this situation. So the chair of the inquiry has said, while we'd all like it to be over within a month, actually it's very important in terms of fairness to all of those parties, and also for our overseas confidence in us, that a robust process happens in a fair way so people have the ability to be heard. But that will come out with very much a factual basis. This is what we believe happened, and this is how agencies responded, right? So do I think that there could be some lessons around risk communication? Absolutely, right? And ironically, before one of our first meetings as Minister for Food Safety was when I was in London chatting with a leading professor in the area of risk communication. So I've been doing a whole lot of reading around the portfolio, and I just thought, I added it onto my agenda and went to university and sat with quite a lot of people that were involved in foot and mouth. And they thought it was, I didn't think it was funny at all, but they thought it was funny that I had sat down and had this big meeting with them around risk communication, and said, partly because of DCD, I said, well, how do we ensure, as New Zealand gets more sophisticated in terms of our detection, that we don't again get penalised for issues that are not food safety but maybe quality issues. And we had a whole conversation, and they told me, that this was the future, that the governments of the future would also ensure that there were institutions that were separate from the political sphere that enabled both domestic customers but people across the world to have confidence in you. And I see the Food Safety Assurance Council as having a little bit of that remit, to be able to scan the horizon and say, well, what is the next DCD or something that may end up in the food chain? What is it that needs to be communicated? Because that council will have public health people, scientists and business people on it. So I do think that's going to be quite a key vehicle. I think the next thing that is the kind of conversation that we need to have is not just around the communication of risk, but it is how we calibrate that risk. And I give the analogy in terms of civil defence. So we've had decades of quite hardcore discussions between what is now GNS, but other agencies that are involved in the science around what's the probability of an earthquake. We've got memorandums of understanding with the media. So you might get a few sensationalist headlines, but you don't see, I would argue, or I haven't seen this as being in the portfolio, massively sensationalist, we're all going to die tomorrow because there's going to be an earthquake. Actually, there's been quite a lot of work that's been done around what is actually an acceptable level of risk. How likely do we think these things can happen? We always have to accept that the thing that we don't predict does happen. It's not the fault of the government, it's not the fault of any particular individual. But what matters, and we can't prevent earthquakes, just like we can't actually prevent food safety scares, is how you respond to them. And so I think it's not a bad analogy. So I think separate to all of the work that we're doing in terms of strengthening the system, I think in terms of restoring confidence, there is quite a big conversation to be had around risk communication, our assessment of risk in the area of food. And then I think finally is the contextual stuff for the world of where New Zealand rates. And this has been the frustrating thing for me, I think, as Minister, right? I can go in the area of education, Associate Minister of Education, I can go and look at an OECD ranking on almost anything, right? But I think in the area of food safety, there is not enough of an infrastructure around how we rank particular countries. And I think that's very important because I'm obviously having a conversation with certain both businesses but also politicians where I've said, well, hang on, we are an open nation. We know that, and one of the big reasons why people buy our products is they know that bloody New Zealand will report anything. But take DCD, we got massively penalised for what was actually a really positive environmental story. It was us trying to clean up our act from a water perspective. But then secondly, our detection methodology is pretty superior. So I think that's where I think I have a role to play, which is around what is it that we can do at an international level to get some core agreement around the indicators. Because in many other countries, people die regularly from food safety incidents. We want to be recognised actually for the fact that we have better detection methodology than a lot of other nations. We also want to be recognised and have actual incentives around us being open and transparent. And I think that's where the crunchy stuff has to happen, because my instincts tell me that that with the world that is happening in terms of social media, with more and more people being online, that consumers will drive the change and transparency of food and access to information, and I'm still doing obviously a lot around that with Australia in terms of food standards and labelling, but also looking at the technology aspect of it. But the crunchy stuff is, if we go open, or too open, too early, then there will be certain people and consumers who will not understand, and they will just report and penalise us. So that's the bit that I need your help with, that I think is one of the crunchiest issues that we will have, just how open do we be without penalising ourselves, which comes back to the WPC incident. But I think there are certain incidents whereby there is no alternative. When you're dealing with babies, when you're dealing with Fonterra, and when you're dealing with a major food safety scare where you just don't know, do you really think that we would have hidden that? Do you really think that we would not have been absolutely open about that? Absolutely not, because even if the baby hadn't died and we had hidden that, we would have lost what is New Zealand's core asset in terms of trust and why people buy our products. I think I've probably said enough. But look, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here tonight. Can I thank you? I've seen the list in terms of the people in this room for what you are doing every day, both in terms of creating wealth. And can I just say that I think there is a huge role to play in terms of New Zealand Asian leaders. I think we haven't had the ability for you to play that role because we've still had inquiries underway. But I think there is a very positive story to eventually tell about this incident, both in terms of its strengthening for our system, but also the small little open nation that leads, that wants to drive transparency across the world, but is getting penalised on the way through. And I think if we can tell that story and you can help us with that, then we will continue to have significant growth in our food products.